A new political season begins in Ukraine. President Poroshenko had made an annual address to the parliament. The speech is widely regarded as highlight the government's priorities for the next year, including the military, fighting corruption and advancing reforms. Much of the speech was devoted to Russian aggression. But what we are supposed to expect this year, our two guests will explain. We have here Olena Shkarpova, who is the economic expert at Vox Ukraine, and your organization have fact-checked this almost 2-hour speech. And also Professor Olexiy Haran, who is also a political analyst, to make a political assessment. So really, probably, Olena, we'd start with you. You've done this fact-checking. Really, what was this something to point out? To what extent the president, he mainly wasn't speaking about the plans, but about what had been achieved either by him. So what is your take?
I would say that the speech was quite good and adequate, but actually President normally speaks pretty well in terms of facts. When you try to fact-check, then almost all the facts are truthful. And when you find some manipulations or falsehood, then usually you pay very much attention to that, because it's not just, he cannot say anything unintentionally. I think he really understands what he says. And in this speech, he was right in many things, many economic things, but when it comes to the Supreme Court procedures, when the judges are chosen to the Supreme Court, then there was really high manipulation, I would say even false, that it wasn't true what he said. And again...
what he tried to sell, then?
Yeah, he said that the society and I don't know in English how it's called, it's Commission of Integrity or Council of Integrity. They're activists that are following the process of choosing the judges. He said that this process was to 80% agreed with this council, but actually it was not. And there were many things that this council didn't agree, which means that President really manipulated in this field.
Professor Haran, so how have you read this speech? If we speak about more like a political statement for the government priorities, there were a lot about financial support of the military. There was something about the EU accessions. So from that, can we understand what the government and the president himself will do during the next political season?
Short answer is yes, we can. But first of all, I would like to react to what my colleague said, because I also checked the material which you prepared by your organization, and actually I found it very useful. Here it is, about more than 10 pages or something like that. And basically what you mentioned, which was a mistake, or you can call it how, untrue, not true or manipulation, actually this is only perhaps one example. There is also another example of some kind of manipulation, but that's it. All other points which were made by President, actually you said this is true. And that was very important for me, because I'm not an economist. So usually judging the economic things, I rely on what economists said. So actually for me it was a pleasant surprise that most what President said wasn't manipulation, what was actually the truth.
I would probably then, since we are into this issue, also would suggest to listen to this couple of quotes, in particularly on, I understand, on the GDP and on the Ukrainian international financial rates.
After 14 quarters of falling, GDP has already been growing for 6 straight quarters. And this, I emphasize, is despite the fact that the bulk of Ukraine's industrial potential is under occupation. Last week, Moody's agency raised Ukraine's credit rating. It is not the first nor the only agency coming to this conclusion. The other two most authoritative agencies did the same thing earlier. In July, I introduced a bill to abolish e-declarations for civic activists.
So, Professor Haran, so imagine you're an an MP, a Ukrainian citizen, or, I don't know, a foreign diplomat who would like to understand where the country is heading and where the most important person in the country, and we understand the president has a lot of power and influence, is moving his country. What is your thoughts?
Well, I would say
What are your
that,
thoughts?
frankly speaking, I would say that perception of all these people, categories you mentioned, would be different.
Yeah.
Because if I am a foreign diplomat, I would say that this is quite balanced speech. And it's about achievements, but also about problems. And usually I would say that the estimation of Western experts is more positive than our Ukrainian perception of what's going on here, because we live in the country, so we feel all the difficulties. And experts, they are talking mostly from, I would say, comparative point of view, comparing Ukraine to other transitional countries or economies. And if we analyze from this perception, the country is moving with all the zigzags, but it's moving. If we are talking about MPs, definitely those MPs who are supporting president and the government, they would say, okay, everything is fine, while opposition deputies would say, no, everything is wrong. And common citizens, basically, I would say that mostly, unfortunately, they distrust authorities because they feel economic difficulties, and we have economic difficulties, and we have macroeconomic stabilization, but common people, they do not feel it, actually. They need to feel it from, in their pockets. So that's why all these perceptions would be different. I am, again, as political scientist, I would stick to the group number one, expert community, which would say the country is moving forward with all the zigzags and problems, but nevertheless the trend is right.
So, Olena, of course, that is exactly your job to say. The president was more or less boasting. That's how I would rather read it, because he was saying about all the good things what government said, and the economy is growing, things are moving in IT. In IT sphere, in that sphere, so there is a bit of a progress. To what extent it is? I understand you fact-check the text, but if we are speaking the general situation, the kind of a positive assessment of the president of the situation of the economy, and the real kind of your organization is also tracking the reforms. So, is there any disproportion?
I wouldn't say there is disproportion, because the economy is really moving forward, and the Ukrainian economy is really recovering, but very slow, I would say. But nonetheless, there are many things to do, and for example, in this political season, the parliament will have to vote for land reform, pension reform, healthcare reform, or at least they have to start discussing them. And this means that these very sensitive things are not solved, and the president haven't mentioned them, as I remember. And it's really important to start moving forward in these fields.
No, actually, he mentioned all these problems, and
but not how to solve them.
But the question, actually, he said very important. He mentioned other problems as well regarding corruption, regarding lifting, for example, MPs' immunity,
which won't take place with this parliament.
Yes, so he hopes that at least the present parliament would make a decision for future MPs. Okay, so it would be possible to move forward here. So he was talking about that. But the problem is, again, how to reach all of these things, how to build majority in the parliament in order to vote for this. What was important is that President said that he is not in favor of early elections and he will not let them happen. So basically this is a strong message, and we understand that it's not in the interest of President or the government to have these early elections. Moreover, I would say that this is not in our national interest, because it would lead to destabilization, kind of, unstable situation. Also, opposition would definitely say differently, because opposition would say, yes, we are in favor of pre-term elections.
Olena, and also there was another issue which I think kind of pretty important. It's about the e-declaration. I would suggest we listen first what President says.
Я вніс до Верховної Ради як невідкладний законопроект про
In July, I introduced a bill to abolish e-declarations for civic activists.
підтримати, щоб справа не виглядала.
I ask you to support it. I am prepared to admit that these declarations were our collective mistake.
Я готовий визнати, що запровадження декларування для цієї групи було нашою спільною помилкою.
So that was the promise of the president, but really, is it the case? Because what we understand, there is something else in the...
Yes, there is something else, and actually he missed a lot of very important information in this case. He offers to abolish this norm of electronic declarations for anti-corruption activists, but at the same time he didn't say that the new law makes it very strict... yes, the bill. It makes it very strict financial reporting for this kind of organizations. And as far as I know, Human Rights Information Center, they are really against this future law. And so it's really a problem. And he didn't mention it.
The main thing here, because I belong to this category, which would, if it doesn't happen, so it would mean that I am also to submit electronic declaration like our MPs, which I do not consider to be just. So basically what President suggests to cancel this norm. So I will not do that, okay? But my organization or other organizations are to show it publicly. Basically, it's not the problem for organizations because anyway we are doing it for our tax administration. So everything is known to our tax administration.
Yes,
there's
that's
nothing
the point.
there's nothing new. But the problem would be to make it public. It would create some problems for
Some
NGOs.
pressure on these organizations.
Yeah.
You know, in this day, of course, there is. I would probably, very shortly ask you, so what you would see yourself, like 1 to 3, the priority, from as a citizen. So, what would be the priority? What do you expect this autumn from the parliament, from the president, where to follow, what to follow? And especially judging from this speech, are these kind of the war agenda, peace agenda, economic agenda, anti-corruption agenda, economic agenda?
Well, I would say again, in general, the speech was good. The question is how to deliver it. And here we will face many, many difficulties. I think some of the reforms would be adopted. We saw actually that reform of education, the law on reform of education system has been adopted. Hopefully the pension reform would be adopted, which is not very popular, which would be a positive move. Regarding peace, I think in general, actually, the strategy here is right. The strategy is right because we understand that it would be almost impossible to see the military solution of the conflict, so we rely mostly on diplomatic efforts, and in this regard, one of the things which is now under discussion is the question of UN peacekeepers, which actually would be helpful for Ukraine if it's implemented.
That's what we discussed before with the Deputy Foreign Minister and Olena. So what are the reforms to follow, ending this segment?
To be honest, I'm not sure any reforms will be accepted in this by this parliament.
And
because I just see, I'm sorry, I just see what the opposition is saying, and their rhetoric is getting worse and worse, and regarding the reforms that I mentioned. So their support is very low.
And at this day, when we are all following what's happening on the Ukrainian-Polish border with Mr. Saakashvili crossing and breaking into the Ukrainian secretary
And breaking the law.
in the Ukrainian territory. So, just being very brief, to what extent it would be the event and what we can expect? How important is this for Ukraine, for Ukrainian political, fight which is taking place?
How much time do we have?
Little, very little. So how important is this story?
Well, I think actually we can analyze the roots. The roots are very contradictory of what happened. But basically what we now have seen at the border, I think it looks like a huge provocation from Saakashvili, and he doesn't care about Ukraine. I think he cares only about his political ratings. And unfortunately, he created the situation where Ukraine is losing, not the power, not authorities or Poroshenko himself, but Ukraine is losing, because the question when the border can be crossed by force by a group of people, including politician or the person who pretend to be Ukrainian politician, this is a very dull for me.
Olena, what is
Yes, I totally agree. I think it's very deep analysis, by the way. And I think that Saakashvili is not thinking about Ukraine, definitely. I'm sorry for such a comment.
Thanks
No, but
for
this is right,
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for explaining and also, catching with the news of today. Really appreciate that you've been with us and explained that to our audience.